From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Malathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture.
Just before this weird weather hit the Pacific Northwest, I had the good fortune to go to the Bald Hill Farm outside of Corvallis. It's managed by the Greenbelt Land Trust. And if you don't know about land trusts, they manage a lot of pollinator habitat across the nation. I had Carolyn Menke, who's the stewardship manager, and Kendra Callahan, events coordinator, walk me through a couple sites where they're doing restoration, and I was astounded, folks. They have some really amazing skills. They've really experimented with how to create pollinator habitat, and I kind of made it my mission, my New Year's resolution, that I'm going to try and get out this year to a number of active restoration sites where people are trying to put pollinator habitat into the landscape, because I know many of you want to learn how to do it, as do I. Speaking of land trusts, however, this Wednesday, January 24th, I'm going to be in Bend at an event organized by the Deschutes Land Trust. It's going to be at the Tower Theater at 7 p.m. You can visit their website to get information, and I really hope to see you there. Okay, without further ado, let's head out to Bald Hill Farm to hear about the efforts there by Greenbelt Land Trust this week on Pollination. So we're here at Bald Hill Farm,
right?
And we just heard. What did we just hear?
We heard some Lewis's woodpeckers, and they are here spending the winter. So we were really excited to see that, because we've done a lot of oak restoration work, and they seem to come through every fall, but then they normally leave. But we had an enormous year of acorn production, and there were so many that it was like walking on ball bearings at times. It was just incredible amount of acorns, and they seem to like it well enough to stay. They're a beautiful woodpecker, green with a rose-colored chest.
Oh.
They're a very interesting bird. They sound a little like an acorn woodpecker, only a little bit higher and faster, I'd say, more of a chuckle. And they also have some really cool behaviors where they will fly out like a flycatcher will do, which is not something you normally see in a woodpecker, but they fly out, they'll catch a bug, and then they fly back to the trees, and they fly much more like a crow when they're just flying across the sky. You know, most woodpeckers have kind of I don't know, how would you call it, a looping flight where they're up and down and up and down. But these woodpeckers, they fly a lot more like a crow. So you can see them from a distance.
Fantastic. Well, it is winter. I'm here with Kendra and Carolyn, and we are walking through. Carolyn, just describe what we're looking at.
So we're on the west side of Bald Hill Farm, and we're walking through a restored upland prairie that also has some Oregon white oaks in it as well, just a few. And so this prairie right now, it's been mowed in the fall. And so we're really just looking at kind of a shag carpet of native perennial grasses. Romer's fescue is what we're seeing most of here. Nice, even green carpet.
I look down, I'm looking right at my feet, and I see little bunches of Romer's fescue, and then I see there's got to be a dozen species of forbs packed in between them.
Yeah, and that's part of the beauty of Romer's fescue, is that as a bunch grass, it leaves spaces. And this is a relatively young prairie. This just was seeded, a few years ago. And so, we're seeing a couple natives. I see some cinquefoil here. That's a perennial. It's a perennial forb. It lives many years, has yellow flowers. And I also see tarweed here, which is a native annual forb. And so having these bunch grasses lets you have this diversity of a mix of species in between the spaces left over from the bunch grasses.
Now, I guess the other thing is it's all, we were talking about this on the drive up to this site, and this is a huge property, but at our first stop here is how short everything is. It's been, I guess, what you were conveying to me, Carolyn, is that if the tendency for grasses is to dominate, and in some ways by this disturbance of cutting it down, or you can tell me a little bit about how that is done, but that opens up spaces for some of these other plants to pop in.
Yeah, so grasslands in general, they're what we call an early cereal stage in terms of an ecosystem. So grasslands, over time, species like shrubs will fill in, eventually trees, and they will change into forests, over that process of ecological succession. So you have to have that process of disturbance to be able to maintain it in this open condition. And so we'd love to have prescribed fire here and burn these prairies. That's probably what kept them historically open, over the last 20,000 or more years with indigenous burning. But instead here, we mow. And so mowing has that same process of removing accumulated plant material from the year. All these species go mostly dormant in the winter. But it also, as you're saying, it by kind of removing some of that thatch, it creates some open spaces. And so that's places where some of these smaller statured forbs can get the light they need, have a little less competition, and be able to grow and bloom the next year.
That's great. And Kendra, you were telling me as well, we were coming up to the site, there was an event earlier where, one of pollinators are one amongst many conservation, there's threatened and endangered plants that you're concerned about.
Correct.
Birds, but you were also interested in butterflies, and you had an event here where, tell us a little bit about, I guess the restoration happens and the plant community is kind of patchy, kind of building around where.
Right. Yeah, I was talking to you about our Planting for Pollinators workshop, and we had families with children that were mostly elementary age, and we did some education stuff, but then we came out here to this beautiful upland prairie to plant both native strawberry and also some onion. And those are both really good early nectar plants for pollinators. And what we were doing was trying to find the spot where you would find the plants that are host plants for the Taylor's checker spot butterfly. And then we would plant in kind of a circle and then out around those plants. So really easy for those butterflies to find those nectar plants in the spring.
I love that as an event because it's kind of a treasure hunt. And then you go around doing restoration. And I love the kind of coherence of those activities.
It was so fun. And the kids were really, really into it too. So especially the onion was very fun to plant because you could just grab whole handfuls of it and pretty easy to get into the ground. Strawberry, a little more finesse required there, but still they did great. And just a real pleasure to see the families out here, helping out and giving back. So it was very fun.
How old is this site? When did restoration begin?
So restoration here, the site preparation, I think started in 2018, 2019. And so that's usually a 2-year process. And then we seed the native species in at the end of that. So this was seeded probably 3 to 4 years ago. Sometimes we'll do multiple seedings, different species followed in a different season by other species.
Oh man, it looks great for you guys have done an amazing job out here. I imagine when we were out of the rain, which we are now, but when we were out of the rain back at the farm, you were also mentioning the challenges in Western Oregon for seeding because we've had, I remember last year the rain happened and then it got cold right away. This year a little bit better, but when these projects it strikes me, are planned years out. You start the restoration, and what happens when you have bad years, or how do you sort of strategize with the seeding, and what kind of tricks are there to kind of get around the Mother Nature's
fickleness?
Yeah. What do you think about this?
It's a constant process of rolling with the weather and adapting your plan. So as you said, nothing really ever goes precisely according to plan. But the challenges frequently are if it's too wet, maybe we can seed upland areas where they're better drained soils. Seeding down in the low clay soil areas, super sticky, isn't going to work. So being strategic. And then watching the weather. almost obsessively to try to plan when that weather window is going to be and where we're going to be, and that all the equipment is there and ready. And that we have the seed in hand. I mean, native seed, we're really lucky in the Willamette Valley to have several really great producers of high quality native plant materials. But sometimes that seed is getting harvested and cleaned in September, and we want to put it on the ground as soon as possible. So again, planning ahead. Did you buy it the previous year? How can you have everything all ready to go, all mixed and loaded? It's quite a process.
I can just imagine. Yes, and I guess there are opportunities to go back over things as well.
Patience is definitely part of it, and again, being open to adapting your plan. So that could mean a couple extra years of site preparation. There's some cost with that. There's some time associated with that. But you have to be flexible. That's all you can do.
Right, because we're dealing with Mother Nature here, so you never know what you're going to get.
Exactly.
Can you, Kendra, just backing up, maybe for some of our listeners, they might be gardeners, they plant in, very kind of manicured settings. They've got their favorite pollinator plants, but why is oak savanna, when we think about insect communities and the creatures that depend on those insects, so important?
Yeah, well, oak savanna is traditionally, historically, one of the things you would have found most in the Willamette Valley. And Carolyn, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're down to about just like 3% of what was left.
That's right.
And so it is something that all of the species here have evolved over time to live in these areas, right? And so when you have the chance to restore it, it's a really great opportunity because so many things are, I think there's over 200 species that rely on Oregon white oak. And then in addition, there's a lot, and a lot of those are, I don't even know how many insect species, but they're very attracted to the oaks in the springtime when they have their flowers. I was just reading about this actually, and I think that they are a wind-pollinated tree, but they do produce something that really attracts a lot of insects. And so I know that there's birds too that time their arrival to when the blooming of those flowers take place. So they're just a really key species, and one that if anyone has a chance to plant in their manicured yard, I would suggest they do that because they're just so important for so many species.
That's totally right, Kendra. And I think one thing we think about too, as we think about changing climate, prairies in the Willamette Valley are incredibly rare. And a really important ecosystem, and species are adapted to those prairies, but potentially as our summers become harsher, having some shade and some of that heterogeneity from those oak trees, we think is going to be beneficial and just provide more heterogeneity and hopefully be able to support, more biodiversity over time.
Right.
No, and I can just imagine they take a long time to grow. So if you have them, retaining them is step one.
Right.
I guess with these properties, that's in some ways their selection. They had trees already on existing.
Yeah, there were a lot of beautiful oaks here already. In a lot of the places where we did the oak restoration, though, we had either like encroachment of shrubs or oftentimes it's fir that grows just particularly well and very fast, and then it shades out the oak trees. So it's important to give them some space to, be that nice mushroom shape that we all think of when we think of a big oak. And it just allows them to not be so spindly and break over, and so that's what we've tried to do here, and so far really successful.
I guess the people here in the Corvallis community have seen a number of part of the property, because some of it's open to the public, be released from fir competition.
Yeah, so here, working with the NRCS with their Environmental Quality Incentives Program, We did this large oak release, here on Bald Hill Farm, then also on Mulkey Ridge Forest, which is adjacent. And the Mulkey Ridge and Fitton Connector Trail go right through it. So all Corvallis Trail users got to watch some of that process with a break in between while the trail was closed. But it was a large effort. But when we can do that on connected properties, the benefit is just enhanced in terms of having a larger patch of this oak savanna type habitat.
Right. Yeah, it created a really beautiful corridor. And if you do have the time and you live around here, I'd totally suggest that. One of my favorite things to do would be to go up to Fitton Green and then just go all the way down and through to Bald Hill. And that's a great hike if you can do it.
It really is.
Yeah.
Well, if I understand from what we were talking about back at the farm, that you have some pollinator areas as well. Shall we pop over there?
Sure.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay, here we are at a second site. We're just down the road, and it looks a lot different. What are we looking at?
So here we're looking at one of the pastures at Bald Hill Farm that we still graze. And so when we acquired Bald Hill Farm, it had been grazed for as long as anyone knew, primarily by cattle. And we kept part of it in grazing, from the get-go as kind of a working lands model in terms of having different types of uses on our conservation land. And soon after that, we realized that we had one of the most important populations of Oregon Vesper sparrow, which is a grassland bird in the Willamette Valley. So this is a really rare species. It migrates down to California in the winter, comes back up here for the spring and summer. And Bald Hill Farm happens to have one of the most important populations in the central Willamette Valley.
They nest here. So, yeah.
Okay, and how is this land kind of specifically well suited to the sparrow?
So Oregon Vesper sparrow is kind of a picky species. We see this with a lot of these rare species that they have really specific habitat preferences. And so Oregon Vesper sparrow, it pretty much uses pastures. Sometimes it will use young Christmas tree farms when the trees are still kind of below waist height. And so it likes to have short vegetation with some tall vegetation, maybe some occasional shrubs, and some bare ground. So when we're looking out here, you're seeing a lower stature grass, and you're seeing some shrubs, you're seeing some patches of taller grass. And so this is much more uneven than where we were last looking at the restored prairie. And so what this is that product of grazing. And so as we try to figure out as land managers, how can we maintain a habitat that Vesper sparrows will like? What we've kind of come down to is that grazing is pretty much the only way we can do it. We can't mow it in March to keep it low for them because the tractor would get stuck. It'd make a huge mess. The soils are way too soft. If we burn it in the fall, if we could, it would just grow back perfectly even. We'd lose the shrub and the taller vegetation. So by bringing cows on in late March, early April, they graze it down. And when the birds arrive in late April, early May to start nesting, the conditions are what they like.
Yep.
So this is how we're managing this habitat for them here. So we're glad we didn't take the cows off when we acquired the property without learning about the property first.
I guess this is a great point. I know we had this conversation back at the farmhouse of that, a lot of pollinator land management often talks about mowing, but in the Willamette Valley in Western Oregon, the time when all that maximal growth is occurring and is the ground is too wet to mow, and so some of those Midwestern practices of mowing to sort of may not fully fit here.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest challenges. And we typically mow in August, when grassland birds are done nesting. And that's also when most of our native flowers are done setting seed. And so it's kind of the end of the cycle for them. Yeah, if we tried to mow this in, April, if we waited till May, we'd be mowing it when the Vesper sparrows and savanna sparrows and other grassland birds are nesting. So we can't do it then. Of course, a challenge, and we're talking about challenges, once it's into August, it's also peak fire season. And so mowing and operating equipment, we have to be super, super careful.
Yeah, it's always it's a kind of little scary time of year for us. A lot of preparation to be sure we're ready for any little spark.
Well-
Just put it out right away.
Well, I guess this is the thing is you've got a lot of land here, and you're varying it for multiple purposes, and I guess this maybe is a good opportunity, Kendra, to just talk a little bit about land trusts. We have several land trusts across Oregon. All have kind of varying and very specific conservation interests, and they seem to sort of function as a real key component. You think of Nature Conservancy as one example, or federally managed land. The wildlife preserves with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. What's the land trust's kind of like role in the sort of the conservation continuum?
Oh, well, we're trying to protect lands in perpetuity, so forever. And I think it can really vary depending on the habitat that you've gotten the chance to conserve or protect. So even among like the properties that we protect, we have very different plans and management plans for those places. Like here, like when we're doing the grazing, and it's for the Vesper sparrows in particular in one spot, and then maybe we focus on the oak restoration in another. And then we have some, but really we're trying to conserve land and water in the Willamette Valley. And our goal is to have it be there for a more resilient future. And so I don't know, does that answer your question?
It does. I guess one of the things that people, land trusts are, have a spatial extent. Like I guess that's the first question. There's a Columbia Land Trust up on the Columbia River area. Mm-hmm. You guys are here, Deschutes Land Trust.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about how, like, you guys, the different land trusts must have some connectivity, or how does this get worked out?
Yeah, we do try to coordinate with everyone. We have a coalition of Oregon land trusts here in Oregon, and we do sort of all have a little bit of a different geographic area. Greenbelt has really focused. We got our start here about over 30 years ago, and we've been trying to protect lands right around the Corvallis area. But then in more recent years, we've really felt like, we need to expand this. Like, the time is like kind of now or never to protect lands in the Willamette Valley as populations, grow really rapidly. And so our area currently is more of the Willamette Valley, but mostly focused on like Benton, Lynn, a little bit in Lane County, and then up a little into Polk County as well. So that's one way we do it. We also just try to really look at properties that have a high conservation value, or like I'm thinking of one of the properties that we acquired this past year, and that was really due to thank you to all our donors and members at Greenbelt, because we were able to really act quickly and protect a property out along where the Willamette and the Luckemute rivers meet, and it's called the Luckemute Confluence property. And so that piece has a really high conservation value. It is on both sides. It connects like two pieces of Oregon State Park property. There's some other properties out there that are all connected. And so we do work with each other to try to make these bigger chunks of land because it provides more habitat value that way.
I imagine that is the challenge. And just talking about members and donations, maybe that's important as well, because oftentimes land comes up unexpectedly. You've been looking, trying to connect pieces of land, and then suddenly something is available, and you don't have a lot of time to act.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, that piece of property in particular, that was one of the things, like a really good example of where a land trust can like step in and move really quickly to acquire properties. Because, like, for example, like if one of the state agencies was to try to acquire that, it could take too long, and then your opportunity would be passed up. So we were really happy to be able to play that role there and connect all those pieces of land. Yeah.
Carolyn, you have anything to add to that, or?
I mean, we work with a broad network of partners. And so, as Kendra said, Coalition Oregon Land Trust, COLT, is a vital piece of that, and Mackenzie River Trust and Columbia Land Trust in particular. But we also work with different state and federal agencies that help us acquire properties. And so, right now we're standing on this property at Bald Hill Farm. Greenbelt owns it, but there's a conservation easement to Bonneville Power Administration because they helped us acquire this property. And so, in general, land trusts, we have that ability to acquire properties. Sometimes Greenbelt owns it, but frequently it's a conservation easement, and the landowner still owns the land, in some cases lives on the land. And so I think land trusts have that ability to, so much of Oregon's Willamette Valley and habitat in private ownership, really bridge that gap so we can have conservation and still have land in private ownership for benefit for habitat and species.
Okay, folks, the rain has come. We are in Oregon. Let's head down. We have one more stop we wanted to make. I think it's a really visible to people who are using the trail system here in Corvallis. Let's head down there.
Okay, that sounds great.
Okay. We are. It is full on coming down now, but we are in a nice little covered area, looking at a vernal pool at some birds that are some waterfowl that are poking around. Tell us a little bit about what we're looking at.
So we're looking at a vernal pool that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, helped us construct, and also some of this restoration is funded by the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. And so at Bald Hill Farm, this was, as we said before, all grazed before. Now we've put most of the property into restoration. And so while we're restoring wet prairie here, we're also trying to restore some of the hydrology to the property. When it was in agriculture, draining water off was the objective, whereas now we're trying to retain that water on the landscape and use it to support more habitat heterogeneity. So by constructing these vernal pools, it captures water which used to flow in a ditch, down into another ditch, into the creek. And now it's captured in this pool. It should be here during the rainy season into the spring. And it provides habitat for waterfowl, for shorebirds, hopefully newts, long-toed salamanders, other amphibians.
We saw some newts going in there this last fall. We have a nice little picture of it crossing the ditch and toward the vernal pool. Whether it's still there or not, we don't know.
Exactly. And because it's pretty close to the established forest here, it's not too much of a stretch to attract those species out. So by creating this vernal pool, again, we're trying to manage the water on the property, but also, create more habitats for more different species.
And longer into the drier season. I think that's the biggest thing that these vernal pools provide, is to just give that extra bit of time where there's water out on the landscape and it's just staying there for longer.
Yes, and that helps, for giving time for those amphibians to complete their life cycles in the spring, especially years where it might dry out faster than they'd like.
And I imagine for all sorts of, all sorts of other plant life, just having just some extra moisture. The way that you described it, and I hadn't thought about this, but you have these kind of vernal pool rings of vegetation that kind of, extend some of the bloom. And I imagine when this... what I'm thinking about pollinators, some of those plants are just going to be able to be more productive. And I imagine this landscape used to have a lot of these little pools that would, vary the plant composition across the landscape.
Yeah, I mean, there was so much wet prairie in the Willamette Valley and a lot of vernal pools before. So, yeah, it's nice to bring a few back.
Absolutely. And And, from that botanical standpoint, it's just like you said, as the water recedes and it dries, it leaves a new rim and seeds germinate. Especially we tend to plant annuals in these areas and they self-seed back in. And so whether it's popcorn flower, whether it's these little Downingia, there's some really neat species that live in these habitats, and they produce a lot of different types of flowers. And then it extends that bloom period. Not being entomologists, we don't know exactly who uses what, but our general rule of thumb is the more variety and the longer period of bloom across the season, that we're providing a bigger benefit and hopefully getting more insects and more pollinators out there.
I guess, the one thing that we were talking back at the last stop about, land acquisition and, some of it through easements, some of it through private donors, some through state and federal initiatives. But I suppose, one of the issues is I can just see, looking around, all the management. We're looking at acres and acres and acres of management, different management, that's going to have to be ongoing. It can't just, you're not acquire the property, seed it. These are ongoing projects. How, tell me a little bit about the challenges of being able to keep this management going.
That is something that we're constantly working towards. So some types of land acquisition funding have the opportunity to also receive a stewardship fund. And so that fund essentially works like an endowment and allows us to have some maintenance funds over time, for things like weed control, for things like maybe maintaining fences or trails. We also spend a lot of time seeking restoration grants. And so these, I mentioned earlier, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We work with all those entities, writing grants for 1 to 3 to 5 years. And we use those to do this restoration. But still, there's that ongoing need for annual maintenance. And so that's where we're really super grateful, especially to our membership and our donors that let us have that flexible funding to do that work, because the maintenance funding usually isn't as appealing to funders for the long haul, because it, land ownership here and this management's in perpetuity. That's a long time for doing annual maintenance.
Yeah. And I would just say, I wanted to add to that too, that the donors are very, very important. And also we're seeing, we want to make sure that people understand too, that if you can't donate money, there's also other ways to get involved. So, that's why we have a full-time volunteer coordinator now. We have volunteers that are coming out to this property every week and helping us with some of the restoration work. That volunteer time is really valuable to us as well. So, if you want to try to get involved that way, there's always the opportunity to do that as well. And if you're interested, the Greenbelt website is a great place to start.
I imagine as well, I'm just looking at the experience a volunteer could get. If you have a acreage and you are interested in these practices, you probably won't get a better education in it than from volunteering.
Yeah, that's so true. I love that you brought that up. And in fact, it just makes me think of one of our neighbors here at Bald Hill Farm, a man who's fairly new to this area. And he's come out and been part of that volunteer crew that comes out every Thursday. And he initially started exactly for that reason. That is what he's told us, is he wanted to see what we were doing here so that he could do the same on his property, which is adjacent to us, and kind of carry that over to his property. So I love that. Love that you brought that up.
Maybe one quick thing before we head back. Just this is, I've been watching this site, I run around here, and I notice it's been in cover crop. It's in a transition period, and the vernal pools have gone. And what can we expect for this area? And I think last year up on that ridge there was a nice display of bloom. But what can we expect this property to look like in the next maybe 5 years or so?
That's a great question. We got part of it seeded this year, so in fall of 2023. And we really hope that the remainder will get seeded coming up this fall in 2024. So You'll see some of like that little preview that you had along the trail with all the great pink and white and yellow flowers, the Clarkia. You'll see some of that hopefully starting in spring 2025 across more of the property.
Well, I am so impressed with all the work that you guys do. Thank you for taking time on a probably one of the coolest days we've had so far.
It's starting to snow. We're not joking around out here. We're committed.
You guys really are. But thanks so much, and thanks for all the work that you do. And I really would encourage everybody. We'll have it in the show notes how to connect with the Greenbelt Land Trust and consider volunteering or making a donation.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.